I'm going to teach you some more of the secrets of life. You ready for that? First of all, there's some math of the math of life, I'll call it. The math of the external world. If you don't know this kind of math, and I'm using the word math pretty, liberally. If you don't understand these things, it's going to be hard to succeed in life. So these are the external things you got to get right. But on the other side of the whiteboard is the fun stuff. If you've got the math of life right, the next thing you need to do is reprogram your brain to optimize it so that you're an optimized instrument in this thing we call life. So I was asked in a prior Periscope to give you a little lesson on hacking your brain. And I'll do this very quickly. I know it looks complicated, but it's really not. It's not. If you don't know this kind of math, and I'm using the word math pretty, liberally. If you don't understand these things, it's going to be hard to succeed in life. And I'll just quickly mention what they are. If you don't know how to diversify your portfolio, or even how to diversify your life, you're going to be in trouble, because diversification just always works. In my case, I diversify my bosses. So I don't have a boss who could fire me, because if I only had one boss, that would be terrible. So I have lots of customers. So lots of my customers can fire me, and I still have a job. So diversify your bosses, diversify your customers, diversify your portfolio. It's one of the most important pieces of math of life you'll ever learn. If you put together your talent stack, I talk about this all the time, it's not just that if you add one talent to the one you have, it's not that you have twice as much. The math of life is that you have something like 3 or 4 times as many options. And every time you add something, it's like your options double. So the math of talent stacks is that they just multiply very quickly every time you add a talent. Here's something else. In terms of luck and the odds, go where there's luck. Go where there's lots of energy, where there's an industry that's taken off, where it's a happening place, if you have the option. We don't all have the option of travel. But if you get the chance, go where the energy is. When I left college, I sold my car for a one-way ticket to San Francisco. Why? Because there was a lot of energy there. Lots of options, lots of stuff. And so some of that energy I could take advantage of. You need some kind of a strategy for making money. Here are two. One strategy is to sell large things like houses or office buildings or commercial jets. Just selling really big ticket items and then taking a percentage. You can get pretty rich that way. Another way would be to sell something that's less expensive, but it can be reproduced easily, such as a Dilbert cartoon or any kind of a license agreement, any kind of a book, that sort of thing. So it doesn't have to be one of these two things, but you should have a strategy of life that if it works out, it's uncapped. It can just grow to the moon. What you don't want to do is sell your time, because the math doesn't work. If you're selling your time and getting paid by the hour, there's really a limit to how much money you'll ever have, because your time cannot be infinitely more expensive. Networking with other people is one of those things that increases your odds of success, by factors of 5 every time you meet somebody. That's probably an exaggeration. But every time you meet one person, it connects you to all of the people they know. So the math of networking is meet one person, and you sort of somewhat adopt their network, because you can always ask that one person for help, and that person will say, oh yeah, I know a guy, let me connect you. So the math of networking is really strong. The math of compounding, if you just add a little knowledge to your life every day. I try to learn something every day, even if it's minimal, that compounds. So in the same way that money and interest compounds, so too does knowledge. So not just in the talent stack way, that's a special way, but any kind of knowledge, it compounds, because the knowledge starts forming connections and patterns that will allow you to take from one field and say, That reminds me of what the Yukon tribesmen did, and I'll use that when I build my network. So you're looking for patterns around the world, and the more of them you see, the more you can put together. And then just risk management in general. So there's lots of et cetera here and miscellaneous, but these are the big things, right? So these are the external things you got to get right. But on the other side of the whiteboard is the fun stuff. If you've got the math of life right, the next thing you need to do is reprogram your brain to optimize it so that you're an optimized instrument in this thing we call life. So I was asked in a prior Periscope to give you a little lesson on hacking your brain. And I'll do this very quickly. I know it looks complicated, but it's really not. It's not. So think of it this way. Think of it in terms of brain hacking is there's power and then there's design. So this is just how much energy your brain is producing. You think of it as like horsepower or wattage. And to have a powerful brain, you got to take care of your diet and your exercise, and your sleep. You want to challenge yourself to learn new things and add variety to your life, so you're not bored about looking at the same stuff. And it's good to have a purpose to energize yourself. All right. So, in my case, that I've been trying to teach myself the drums, because that for me is a big challenge, because that's so outside my realm of any kind of natural talent. So, but I do that intentionally because I'm trying to power my brain. So I'm always paying attention to these. Now, the biggest mistake people make, in my opinion, maybe in their whole life, this might be the biggest mistake people make in their whole life. And you're not going to believe it, but I'll tell you. And that is to think that diet and exercise are the things that you can put off because you're busy. Those are the things you're like, well, I'll just eat some fast food. It's faster. Or, no, I'll skip the gym today. But if you get these things right, every other part of your life is easier. Your job, your romantic life, your health, your brain actually will function better. Just everything's better. So if you don't start here, you're going to be in bad shape. All right. So then the next part is design, and this is the fun part. You should read a book called Habit. There are several books. You can just Google it. So learn how to build habits. Building a habit is doing something in a repetitive way that gives you a reward, and there's a payoff. So like Pavlov's dogs that would salivate when the bell was rung, because they knew that some food was coming. You can actually train yourself like a dog to do the things that you wanted to do simply by giving yourself a reward. So I've said before that if I exercise, I always make sure that after my exercise, I've scheduled some downtime where I'm just relaxing, having a protein shake, cup of coffee, protein bar, looking at my Twitter, whatever, stuff I want to do. So it's just this really good feeling of being done exercising, and you're just chilling out. So build in little rewards for the things you want to make habits. And read my book, How to Fail at Almost Everything and Still Win Big, to learn how to build systems to make all this stuff easy. Ideally, you want to build systems that make it easier to do things right than it would be to do it wrong. That's the whole thing. So you're working on your brain. So don't think in terms of, how can I make my muscle bigger? That's the wrong mindset. You should think in terms of, how can I make exercise a habit? Because if you get that right, everything else is going to work out. Eventually you're going to say, well, I go to the gym every day. Maybe I'll try that other machine. Or maybe I'll talk to Bob and see what he's doing. Or maybe I'll try what he's doing. So you end up doing everything right in the long run just by trial and error and learning how to exercise properly. But you got to get the habit thing right. That's what the How to Fail book will tell you. All right. So here are the other things. Contrast. Did I leave off the most important one? I did. Association. So that's the concept behind building a habit. So if you associate, hey, every time I do this, I get a reward, you've associated a reward. And I've used this technique of associating a reward with a behavior. You can change your preferences. You can change your preferences, which would effectively make you a different person if you had different preferences. Show the full board. There you go. And sorry, that's about right. And so, anytime you want to make yourself like something that you don't want to like, associate it with something pleasurable, and eventually you'll just train yourself. Contrast is the idea that you use contrast all the time. So you would say, for example, well, what's the worst thing that could happen? And if you think the worst thing that could happen is, unlikely and it's over here, then what does happen that's more likely just doesn't seem so bad. So you probably will recognize the times to use contrast, but if you use it willfully, you can fool yourself into liking something that you didn't like as much simply by thinking of something that contrasts with it in the way that helps you go that way. So you want to focus. Whatever you focus on, the act of focusing on something causes you to tune your mind to notice opportunities. I was walking down the street yesterday, and I found a $20 bill laying in the grass next to the sidewalk, and you might ask yourself, well, how long has that been there? It's a sidewalk. How many people didn't see a $20 bill laying on the ground? And it was old and withered. But I've always expected to find money. Since I was a kid, one day I found a bunch of money by the side of the street. So I told myself when I was a kid to always look for money. And so I do. So if I'm just walking somewhere, it's just a lifetime habit, I'm always looking for money. And you would be amazed how often you can find money lying on the ground if you're looking for it. If you're not looking for it, apparently you don't see it, because I saw a $20 bill lying there, and I don't know how many people walked by before that. So I spend lots of times literally picking up free money, because if you focus on anything, it tunes your filter to just see more of it. So that's a hack. Framing is important. For example, when I say, I told you the trick of, instead of seeing yourself as this creature in the world that's oppressing you, don't think of yourself as a victim. That's one frame. Think of yourself as somebody who's going to win. And another frame is to imagine that you're a creature inside a robot body, and this is just a game you're playing. And when you're moving your big robot body, this isn't you. This body is not me. The me is inside me, and I'm just telling this what to do, and it's just like a video game. And that's a frame that you can use to avoid stress, because it just puts you in a whole different world. You're like, oh, I'm just operating a video game. All right, boom, 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 boom. Now, it doesn't have to be true. It just has to be an imaginary world that you can put yourself into to get an effect. In other words, you could hack your brain by simply changing your frame. You don't have to believe it. That's the important part. You simply have to spend time thinking in that way to get the result. Ego death is very important. Your ego is what usually holds you back, because you're afraid of being embarrassed. You're afraid of being rejected. You're afraid of getting fired. And your ego is what makes you afraid, because your ego tells you you're important. The moment you realize you're completely unimportant, because the universe is just particles bumping around, then you can get past those fears. So these fears will hold you back until you learn to kill your ego. You might use psychedelics to do that. All right. Shelf space is the idea that whatever you spend time thinking about crowds out the other thoughts. So if you have a natural inclination to think negative thoughts, there's nothing you can do to stop negative thoughts directly. You can't say, stop thinking about that. That doesn't work. That would not be a brain hack. But you can fill up all the space with your own thoughts. So you can actively say, all right, I'm going to think about X. Think about X. Think about X. And you find find some kind of pleasant, hypothetical thought, I would often think about being invited to the White House for decades. I would think, all right, what would I do that would cause me to get invited to the White House? Now, because we must live in the simulation, I eventually got invited to the White House, which is weird. What are the odds of that? But it doesn't matter if it's likely or unlikely. It doesn't have to be something you think might happen. Just think of what would be the most fun thing that could happen, and just live in that world for a while, especially if you're trying to go to sleep. It'll just crowd out the bad thoughts. And eventually you learn those bad thoughts will atrophy after a while, because if you don't reinforce them, they will shrink over time. It might take years, but they will. Optimism is what you fill your shelf space with. The power of positive thinking is extraordinarily powerful. Because if you're a positive person, people want to be around you. You're going to take the right kind of risks. You're going to not be crushed by failure, because you say, I'll make it next time. Optimism is partly, I think, something that's natural in some people, but it is my experience that you can totally hack this one. This is one of the most hackable elements in the whole situation. You can simply act like an optimist and you get the same results, and eventually you become one. Right? So I would say that I spent years pretending to be an optimist, and now I am. Because it's just my reflex to say, oh yeah, that's some bad news, but what about all this stuff? There's going to be some good stuff. So you simply build a habit of optimism. You simply say an optimistic thing, or you think an optimistic thing as a rule. If anything negative comes out of your mouth, this is one of the rules I try to follow, as best I can. If I have to say something negative, and we all have to sometimes, I try to come up with something positive, and it's just my rule. So that's a brain hack. Say something negative because you couldn't avoid it, boom, add a positive thing. Fills up your shelf space. You want to also travel and optionally psychedelics, because the more experiences you have, the more you understand that your point of view is subjective. So if you travel, you meet other people who see the world so differently, and yet they can survive and have families and good lives. And you say, wait a minute, why is it that all these people are seeing a completely different reality? They've got a different religion, their beliefs, it's all different, and yet they get along fine. Their life is fine. You really have to experience that to understand how subjective your experience of life is. And of course, the talent stack is a way to hack your brain, because you're adding talents that are unique. You're adding talents that stack well together. They just work together well, and that makes you unique. And that literally is changing the structure of your brain. But if you have the right talent stack, they will also form connections that would not be obvious. Now, an obvious connection would be, let's say you're good at engineering, and then you learn to be a public speaker. Well, it's obvious that those two just go together, but that's all they do. They just work well together. But suppose you learned physics and programming. You probably would have more opportunity to say, nobody's ever done this in programming before, but in the world of physics, they solve a problem this way. I wonder if I could learn something from physics and then take it over to this other field, even as an analogy to sort of brainstorm and then come up with a solution. So a talent stack will allow you to have accidental connections that could be very valuable. And here's the fun part. These are actually like physical changes in your brain. Everything you learn is a physical change in your brain, otherwise it wouldn't be maintained. You need to learn persuasion, the whole topic, because it allows you to see it and recognize it, and then act more effectively. So this is more of a catch-all. Visualizing is very important. You want to visualize exactly what it is that you want. If you want something specific, just think about it, visualize it. You could call this affirmations, the act of writing down and visualizing your goal 15 times a day. You write it down 15 times a day and visualize it. Very important, because your brain is a visual engine. And so if you get your visual focus on, and this is really related to focus as well. So if you've got a visual element to your focus, it improves your focus, and you get all those benefits. I also recommend having stories of you, which is to cobble together the stories of your life that, in your opinion, would represent you. And you have the option of forgetting the stories that would be inconvenient or you wouldn't like what that did to you. Now, of course, those bad stories may well be part of your current personality. But you can choose to sort of craft yourself into the version you want to be by simply deciding which stories define you. I told you that my stories have me winning against all odds. And indeed, I experience it. In my real life, I seem to win against all odds fairly consistently. Well, like way more than any kind of statistical probability would suggest. I assume it's just, psychological and it could all be explained somehow. But make some stories of you that turn you into the person you want to be. And then, of course, setting your priorities is how you tune your brain to decide what's important and manage everything else. So those are the main hacking techniques. If I thought about it, I could probably think of a half a dozen or a dozen more. But these are the ones I use. And I would say that you're not going to get some gigantic benefit on day one. These are the things that you should find a way to use all of your life. When I became a trained hypnotist, and I could see the actual mechanical, let's say, reality of your brain, that the way hypnotists work is they don't have a belief system. That's important anyway. So hypnosis is just a set of techniques that have been figured out over time, and the hypnotist knows, well, when I do this, I get this kind of outcome. And that's what it is. And so it's very much like programming. So, if you're programming a computer, you don't say, well, what will be the motivation of the hardware when it sees my code? It doesn't have motivation, it just executes the code. And a hypnotist learns that the human mind is just like that. The human mind artificially assigns reasons to things, but the reasons aren't real. They're rationalizations after the fact. The reason that the brain did it is because some software was introduced. That's all. Your brain just did what the software told it to do. And then after that you say, well, the reason I did this is because of my priorities and my philosophy and all that, but it's not real.